The FBI kept a file on Marilyn Monroe. Everyone knows that. What they don't know is why nearly half of it remains classified to this day, 60 years after her death. Page 47 of the declassified documents mentions a Negro male associate seen with Monroe at multiple high-profile events in 19... The name is redacted, the dates are redacted, but the surveillance notes are crystal clear. Subject observed in close proximity to Monroe at presidential function. Recommend continued monitoring. For decades, people assumed those files were about the Kennedys, about mob connections, about communist sympathies. They were wrong. Recently uncovered photographs and testimony from people who were there that night reveal the truth. Marilyn Monroe and Harry Belafonte had a relationship that Hollywood, the White House, and even Belafonte's own team worked desperately to keep hidden. Not because it was romantic, though some insist it was, not because it was scandalous, though in 1962 America it was the most dangerous scandal imaginable, but because it proved Marilyn wasn't the naive sex symbol they sold to the world. She was a woman who, in the most segregated moment of American history, chose to stand beside the most radical black activist in Hollywood, and that choice, according to people who knew her best, is what signed her death warrant. Cecil Stoughton, the White House photographer, took one picture of them together. He never released it during his lifetime. When it finally surfaced in 2008, most people didn't understand what they were looking at, but the people who were there that night, the ones still alive, they knew exactly what it meant. And now, finally, so will you. Before we dive deeper into this story, if you're fascinated by the untold secrets of Hollywood's golden age, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We bring you the hidden truths that changed entertainment history forever. May 19, 1962, Madison Square Garden was packed with 19,000 people, all there to celebrate President John F. Kennedy's 45th birthday. Marilyn Monroe, wrapped in a skin-tight, flesh-colored gown covered in 2,500 rhinestones, stepped onto that stage and sang Happy Birthday in a breathy, seductive voice that stopped the world. Cameras flashed. The crowd roared. President Kennedy laughed from his seat, visibly charmed. The moment became iconic instantly. The ultimate symbol of Monroe's status as America's sex symbol, forever intertwined with the most powerful man in the world. But what happened after the cameras stopped rolling, that's where the real story begins, and it's a story that Hollywood spent decades trying to bury. The after-party was held at the home of Arthur Krim, president of United Artists, in a luxurious townhouse on the Upper East Side. This wasn't a public event. No press was allowed inside. Only the elite studio executives, senators, White House staff, and a carefully selected group of entertainers were permitted entry. And yet in that room full of power brokers and politicians, two people who, according to the unwritten rules of 1962 America, should never have been seen together, were standing side by side, Marilyn Monroe and Harry Belafonte. One photograph captured the moment. Cecil Stoughton, the official White House photographer, had been documenting the evening as part of his duties. In one frame, taken sometime after midnight, you can see President Kennedy in the center, smiling, drink in hand. Robert Kennedy stands just to his left, engaged in conversation. And there, in the background but unmistakably present, are Marilyn and Belafonte. They're close, too close for casual acquaintances. Marilyn's body language suggests ease, familiarity. Belafonte's expression is unreadable, but his proximity to her speaks volumes. For anyone who understood the social codes of 1962, this photograph was dangerous. Not just for Marilyn, but for everyone in that room. Harry Belafonte wasn't just another entertainer. By 1962, he was one of the most visible and vocal supporters of the civil rights movement. He had marched with Martin Luther King Jr. He had personally funded freedom rides in the South. When Dr. King needed bail money, he called Belafonte. When activists needed someone to draw media attention to their cause, they called Belafonte. He was beloved by Black America and feared by white establishment figures who saw him as a threat to the status quo. And here he was, at a party celebrating the President of the United States, standing next to the most famous white woman in the world. Stoughton took that photograph and never released it. Not during the Kennedy administration, not during the decades of conspiracy theories that followed Marilyn's death. Not even in his own memoir. The image didn't surface until 2008, 6 years after Stoughton died, when a collector discovered it in a batch of archived White House photographs. By then, most of the people who had been in that room were dead. The few who remained refused to comment, and the world, distracted by other scandals and other mysteries, barely noticed what they were looking at. To understand why that photograph mattered, you have to understand what America was like in 1962. Interracial marriage was illegal in 16 states. Black Americans were fighting for the right to sit at lunch counters, to attend white schools, to vote without being terrorized. Hollywood reflected those divisions. Black actors were relegated to supporting roles, maids, butlers, sidekicks. They weren't allowed to play romantic leads opposite white actors. And they certainly weren't allowed to socialize with white stars outside of carefully controlled publicity events. The studios enforced these rules ruthlessly, terrified of the Southern market. Movies that featured interracial themes were banned in the South. Theater owners refused to show them. Audiences boycotted them. But Marilyn Monroe didn't care about the rules. It started in 1955, 7 years before that photograph was taken. Ella Fitzgerald, already a legendary jazz singer, was struggling to break into the elite nightclub circuit. The top venues, places like Mocambo in Los Angeles, refused to book her. The owners claimed it was about her style, but everyone knew the real reason. Ella Fitzgerald was black, and Mocambo, like most high-end clubs in 1950s America, catered to white audiences who didn't want to see black performers as headliners. Marilyn heard about this and decided to do something about it. She picked up the phone, called the owner of Mocambo, and made him an offer he couldn't refuse. She told him that if he booked Ella Fitzgerald, she would personally attend every performance and sit at the front table. She promised that the press would follow her, that photographers would capture her enjoying Ella's show, and that the publicity would be worth far more than any potential backlash. The owner agreed, Ella got the booking, and Marilyn kept her promise. She showed up, night after night, sitting front and center while cameras flashed and reporters took notes. The gamble worked. Ella's performances at Mocambo were a sensation. Her career took off in a way it never had before. Years later, Ella would say in an interview, "I owe Marilyn Monroe a real debt. She personally called the owner of Mocambo and told him she wanted me booked there. After that, I never had to play a small jazz club again." But what Marilyn did for Ella wasn't just an act of kindness. It was a statement. It was Marilyn using her power to challenge the system that had built her. And it was the first sign that she wasn't content to stay in the box Hollywood had created for her. By the time Marilyn met Harry Belafonte, she had already established herself as someone willing to cross racial lines in ways that made studio executives nervous. But her relationship with Belafonte was different. This wasn't just about supporting a black artist from a distance. This was about personal connection, about shared values. The exact details of how they met are murky. Some accounts suggest they were introduced at a Hollywood party in the late 1950s. Others claim they met through mutual friends in the civil rights movement. What's clear is that by the early 1960s, they were part of the same social circle, a small, progressive group of entertainers and activists who were pushing back against segregation and injustice. This circle included people like Sidney Poitier, who was breaking barriers as the first major black leading man in Hollywood. It included writers and intellectuals who were documenting the civil rights movement. And it included Marilyn, who was increasingly drawn to people who challenged her to think beyond the shallow world of studio politics and tabloid gossip. Belafonte saw something in Marilyn that most people missed. He didn't see the dumb blonde or the tragic starlet. He saw a woman who was curious, who was politically engaged, who was trying to use her platform for something meaningful. In interviews decades later, Belafonte would occasionally mention Marilyn in passing, always with a tone of respect. He never revealed the full extent of their friendship. He never discussed what they talked about in private. But he made it clear that she was someone he admired, someone who understood the stakes of what he was fighting for. But that friendship came with risks. Enormous risks. For Marilyn, being seen with Belafonte meant potential career suicide. The studios were already frustrated with her. She was difficult on set, constantly late, demanding rewrites and creative control. Her marriages had failed. Her mental health was deteriorating. The pills she relied on to sleep, to calm her nerves, to get through the day, were becoming a public scandal. And now, on top of all that, she was associating with the most radical black activist in Hollywood. Studio executives warned her. Her agents begged her to be more careful about who she was seen with in public. They reminded her that her image was everything, that one wrong move could destroy the carefully constructed persona that had made her a star. But Marilyn didn't listen. By 1962, she was exhausted by the pressure to be perfect, exhausted by the men who used her and discarded her. And in Belafonte, she may have found someone who represented the opposite of all that, someone who used his fame to fight for justice, someone who wasn't afraid to stand up to power, someone who saw her as more than just a body, more than just a fantasy. The Kennedy birthday party wasn't just a celebration, it was a carefully orchestrated political event designed to boost the president's image and raise money for the Democratic Party. Every detail was planned, every guest was vetted, and every photograph was supposed to reinforce the narrative that Kennedy was beloved by Hollywood. Marilyn's performance was supposed to be the highlight of the evening, and it was. But it was also the beginning of a crisis that would haunt her for the rest of her short life. The after-party was supposed to be private, a place where the president and his inner circle could relax without the scrutiny of the press. But it was also a place where social hierarchies were on full display. The most powerful people in America were in that room, and they were watching each other, watching who talked to whom, watching who got too close to the president, watching who stepped out of line. Marilyn, by this point, was already a problem. Her affair with JFK was an open secret among Washington and Hollywood insiders. The president's staff had been trying to distance Kennedy from Marilyn for months. Robert Kennedy had been tasked with handling the situation, convincing Marilyn to back off, to stop calling, to stop showing up at events where she might embarrass the administration. But Marilyn wasn't backing off, and at the after-party she wasn't focused on Kennedy at all. She was talking to Harry Belafonte. Witnesses who were there that night remember the tension in the room. They remember seeing Marilyn and Belafonte standing together deep in conversation, seemingly oblivious to the fact that everyone was watching them. They remember the way Robert Kennedy kept glancing over at them, his expression unreadable. They remember the way studio executives whispered to each other, clearly uncomfortable with what they were seeing. And they remember the way Cecil Stoughton captured it all. Stoughton wasn't supposed to be taking candid shots at the after-party. His job was to document official moments, carefully posed photographs that would reinforce the Kennedy mythology. But something about that night made him reach for his camera. He took the picture, and then he locked it away. For 46 years, that photograph remained buried in the White House archives. Historians researching the Kennedy administration never saw it. Biographers writing about Marilyn Monroe never knew it existed. When the photograph finally surfaced in 2008, it was included in a collection of previously unreleased White House images. Most media outlets barely mentioned it, but no one seemed to grasp the significance. No one asked why Stoughton had hidden it. No one wondered what Marilyn and Belafonte had talked about that night. No one connected the dots between that photograph and what happened to Marilyn just 3 months later. After the Kennedy party, things moved fast for Marilyn. Too fast. Within weeks, she was fired from her latest film, Something's Got to Give, after showing up late repeatedly and missing entire days of shooting. The studio suspended her contract and announced they were suing her for $500,000. Marilyn fought back. She hired a new publicist and started doing damage control. She posed for a series of photographs with George Barris, images that would later become iconic, showing her vulnerable and raw. She gave interviews claiming she was turning her life around, ready to be taken seriously as an actress. But behind the scenes, her life was falling apart. The Kennedys had cut her off completely. Robert Kennedy had reportedly told her in no uncertain terms that she needed to stop calling the White House. Her affair with the president was over. She was alone. And according to people who knew her during those final weeks, she was terrified. Not just sad or heartbroken, terrified. She told friends that she felt like she was being watched. She claimed that her phone was tapped, that people were following her. She said she had information that could destroy powerful people, information about the Kennedys, about Hollywood, about things the public wasn't supposed to know. Most people dismissed this as paranoia. But what if it wasn't? What if Marilyn really did have information that made powerful people nervous? And what if that information wasn't just about her affair with JFK, but about the people she had been spending time with? The FBI had been monitoring Belafonte for years. His involvement in the civil rights movement, his financial support for activists, his friendship with Martin Luther King Jr., all of it made him a target. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover was obsessed with discrediting the civil rights movement, and he saw Belafonte as a key figure who needed to be watched. Hoover's FBI kept detailed files on anyone associated with civil rights activism. They wiretapped phones, they photographed meetings, and if Marilyn Monroe was associating with Harry Belafonte, you can bet the FBI was paying attention. The declassified FBI files on Marilyn Monroe are heavily redacted, but what remains is telling. There are multiple references to her associations with subversive individuals. There are surveillance reports documenting her attendance at certain events, and there are notes recommending continued monitoring, not because of her relationship with the president, but because of who else she was spending time with. Page 47 mentions a Negro male associate seen with Monroe at a presidential function. The name is blacked out, the date is blacked out, but the description matches the Kennedy birthday party. And the recommendation is clear: keep watching her. There were rumors that Marilyn wanted to do a film with Harry Belafonte. The details are hazy and no official record exists, but people who worked in Hollywood during that era remember whispers about a project that would have paired them as co-stars. It was supposed to be a drama, something serious and socially relevant, a film that would challenge the audience, that would force them to confront their own prejudices. Marilyn was excited about it. She saw it as a chance to prove she was more than just a sex symbol. Belafonte was reportedly interested, too. He had already proven himself as a leading man in films like Island in the Sun, a 1957 drama that featured interracial romance and was banned in several southern states because of it. He knew the risks, but he also believed that entertainment could be a tool for social change. But the project never happened. The studios shut it down before it could even get off the ground. Officially, they claimed it wasn't commercially viable. They said audiences weren't ready for that kind of film. But the real reason was simpler. They were terrified. Terrified of the South. Terrified of boycotts. Terrified of what it would mean for Marilyn Monroe, their biggest star, to be seen as someone who openly challenged racial norms. Marilyn was devastated when the project was killed. It was one of many disappointments that contributed to her downward spiral in 1962. She had wanted so badly to be taken seriously, to be seen as an actress with depth and intelligence, and every time she tried to break free from the image Hollywood had created for her, she was shut down. The studios wanted the blonde bombshell. They wanted the giggling, breathy-voiced sexpot. They didn't want a woman with political opinions. They didn't want someone who challenged the status quo. And when she refused to stay in that box, they made her pay for it. They fired her from films. They spread rumors about her being difficult, unstable, unreliable. They leaked stories to the press about her pill use, her failed marriages, her mental breakdowns. They turned her into a cautionary tale. And when she died, just 3 months after that photograph was taken, they erased the parts of her story that didn't fit the narrative they wanted to tell. They focused on the Kennedy affair. They talked about her tragic childhood, her failed relationships, her addiction to pills. They turned her death into a mystery, a conspiracy, an unsolvable puzzle. But they never talked about Harry Belafonte. They never mentioned the photograph. They never acknowledged that Marilyn Monroe, in the final months of her life, had been part of a circle of people who were fighting for civil rights. They buried that part of her story because it was inconvenient, because it suggested that maybe Marilyn was more than what they wanted her to be. On the night of August 4th, 1962, Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her home. The official cause of death was acute barbiturate poisoning, ruled a probable suicide, but the circumstances were suspicious from the start. The timeline didn't make sense. The people who had seen her that day gave conflicting accounts, and most troubling of all, certain items were missing. Marilyn's diary was never found. The red notebook she had been seen carrying in the weeks before her death, the one where she allegedly documented her relationships and secrets, vanished. Phone records from her house that night were confiscated and never made public. And the people who might have had answers, Peter Lawford, who had spoken to her hours before she died, Eunice Murray, her housekeeper, Dr. Ralph Greenson, her psychiatrist, all told stories that contradicted each other and changed over the years. For decades, investigators and conspiracy theorists have tried to piece together what really happened that night. Most theories focus on the Kennedys. Did Robert Kennedy visit her that evening? Did the mob target Marilyn to send a message? Or was it really just a tragic accident? But what if the focus on the Kennedys has always been a distraction? What if the real reason Marilyn had to die wasn't about who she was sleeping with, but about what she represented? In the decades since Marilyn Monroe's death, her image has been commodified, mythologized, and dissected endlessly. She has been portrayed as a victim, a tragic figure destroyed by fame and men and her own demons. Books, films, documentaries, and conspiracy theories have all tried to explain who she really was, but almost none of them mention Harry Belafonte. Almost none of them talk about Ella Fitzgerald and the Macombo Club. Almost none of them acknowledge that Marilyn Monroe, in her own imperfect way, tried to push back against the racist structures of Hollywood, because that part of her story doesn't fit the narrative. It complicates the image of Marilyn as a passive victim. It suggests that she had agency, that she made choices, that she stood for something, and maybe that's exactly why it had to be erased. Because if people knew that Marilyn Monroe had been friends with Harry Belafonte, that she had supported the civil rights movement, that she had wanted to make films that challenged segregation, then her death becomes something more than just a tragic accident or a scandalous mystery. It becomes a silencing, a deliberate erasure of a woman who refused to stay in her place. The photograph that Cecil Stoughton took on May 19, 1962, is proof that Marilyn Monroe and Harry Belafonte were part of the same world, if only for a moment. It shows them standing together in a room full of power, breaking every unspoken rule of American society. Harry Belafonte lived to be 96 years old. He spent his entire life fighting for justice, refusing to be silenced or controlled. When he died in 2023, tributes poured in from around the world. But even in those tributes, Marilyn Monroe was barely mentioned. Their friendship was treated as a footnote. But maybe it shouldn't be. Maybe that friendship tells us something important about both of them, about Marilyn's desire to be more than the image Hollywood created for her, about Belafonte's ability to see people beyond the roles society forced them into, and about the cost of defying the systems that keep us divided. There are still so many unanswered questions about Marilyn Monroe's final months. We may never know the full truth. Too many people are gone, too many records have been destroyed, but what we do know is this: Marilyn Monroe was not the helpless victim the world wanted her to be. She was a woman trying to take control of her narrative, trying to use her fame for something meaningful, trying to be seen as more than just a body. And in a world that punished women for wanting more, that punished white women for crossing racial lines, that made her dangerous, the photograph of Marilyn Monroe and Harry Belafonte is a small piece of a much larger story, a story about power and control, about racism and sexism, about the ways Hollywood worked to maintain a system that kept people in their place. Marilyn Monroe wasn't just a sex symbol, she wasn't just a tragic figure, she was a woman who tried to make a difference. And maybe that's the most dangerous thing she ever did.